next speaker in the EOS series is going to be Dean Oliver and Alok Patani. They'll be talking about a new addition to college basketball analytics, which is the Basketball Power Index. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dean and Alok to the stage.
He introduced us. He didn't introduce our game day crew, so I'll let them go right now. If we can get the sound.
By the subjective measure in the polls, Kentucky is #1, but you look at some of the power indexes, the Cats aren't there. However, on ESPN.com, just today, we're unveiling a new basketball power index. It takes a lot of things into account, puts them into what we believe is going to be a definitive tool. It's not going to wreck the RPI, make us not pay attention to that anymore, but look at the difference, at least the slight differences in the new BPI that you can find on ESPN.com. It has Kentucky #1. Top 5 teams you would probably expect. Michigan State a little bit higher than it is in the RPI. Now, in terms of what is entailed in this BPI, it takes all of the Division I games. It takes into account where they're played. It also takes into account the pace, strength of the opponent, and also, perhaps importantly, whether any top players missed the game. Jay, you and our researcher, the Bull, Jason McCallum, has been instrumental in putting this together. Why do you think this is going to work effectively?
Well, I think it's the measure that I would look at first. Our analytics team put in a tremendous amount of work on this, and I got a chance to watch it up close, what they did. I would look at the BPI first before anything else, but that doesn't mean that I wouldn't use the Sagarin and KenPom.com. I have used those since I first found out about them. I think they're fabulous. I think this gives you another way of looking at the game, maybe a little bit deeper, especially with the strength of schedule elements, the fact that missing players are taken into account. There are some differences in it that I think will enhance your ability, not only in telling you what these teams have achieved and how good they are, but as a predictive measure for how they would do in the NCAA tournament against like teams.
You know, when you start looking at the strength of schedule component, unique thing that our analytics team put together, it takes into account basically every game. They describe it as like a spider web that reaches through every game played and tries to give you a determination of how teams are. And the way Hubert loves these numbers.
I love the RPI, strength of schedule.
I love the eye test.
And now we added another
test.
It has Kentucky #1, just like
the eye test. Right here.
The BPI test works too.
Yeah.
Yes. I love watching those guys, in fact. They do a very good job. As you got a sense from that, Jay Billis was a major motivating factor in generating what you might call as a general tool, a schedule adjuster. That is a lot of, that needs to be a tool in any analytics, sports analytics person's tool belt. It is something that we had talked about, and when we heard from Jason McCallum, who was also mentioned on there, that Jay really wants to do this. Reese Davis wants to do this. We built ours. And I'm not going to do a lot of this presentation. It's going to be Alok Patani, who I met several years ago. He is very good at these schedule adjusters, as well as a number of other things in sports analytics. I'm just going to give you a little bit of the background for how we kind of evolved, just from a business perspective. Those guys came in, and we talked to them. They said some of the things they wanted to do. We asked them questions. There are questions about, are we trying to pick what is the best team at the end of an NCAA tournament? Are we trying to pick who should be in the NCAA tournament? These are not necessarily easy questions for them to answer because we know about the math. They know about what they're trying to do. But at least Jay could come in and say, yeah, when it comes down to Selection Sunday, I want to have a tool that I can rely upon for making certain statements about the quality of these teams. And as Alok will go through, we put in a lot of thought to different aspects of this. And we put what we think are some of the best things from other schedule adjusters into this. With that, I'll let Alok take over and give you some of the details after the Cliff Note version.
Thanks a lot, Dean. Also, we have a bottom line that's scrolling the rankings right now, so in case you want to check that out. Okay, so before we got to designing the system, obviously we're aware that there's other systems out there. The most prominent one is the RPI. It was designed several decades ago. The reason it's prominent is because it's used by the NCAA Selection Committee on Selection Sunday leading up to it to decide the teams. They don't follow it exactly, but they do use it as a component. Another standard that's been out there for a while is the Jeff Sagarin's ratings that he publishes on USA Today. For those of you familiar, he actually has 2 different ratings: the ELO chess rating, which only takes into account whether you won or you lost. No margin of victory is not included, so as to not incentivize running up the score, things like that. The predictor rating does take into account points, and he says that it's more representative of the team's actual quality going forward, wins, losses, etc. In the last several years, Ken Pomeroy's rankings on his site have gotten a lot more attention, both in the media. You heard Jay Billis mention it on that game day segment, and from coaches, from college basketball coaches. We have a lot of respect for Ken Pom's work. It's based off of a lot of the things that Dean wrote about in Basketball on Paper in terms of offensive and defensive efficiencies, and again, it has that schedule adjustment, opponent adjustment in there. And finally, one of the sort of like really new systems that is gaining some attention is this Bayesian LRMC system. Actually, in the proceedings of this conference, I believe there's a paper about how that system has done over the last couple of years in terms of predicting NCAA tournament games, and it's done very well compared to all their systems. But that system is designed for prediction of the tournament. So for that, before we get into comparisons between BPI and the other systems, I want to go over basically the basics of calculating BPI. So the outcome we look at is the team's net efficiency in each game, points per 100 possessions, better or worse than the opponent. Again, that takes into account the pace. We want to say like a team that wins by 8 in a 50-possession game, it's more impressive than winning by 8 in a 100-possession game. The next thing we do is we translate it to a 0 to 100 percentile-like score. The key here is, so if you win by 8 at home, how often do teams win by 8 or more at home? And then we translate that to a percentile. If you win by 8 on the road, that's more rare, so it's going to get you a slightly higher score. What it does is it creates this diminishing returns for blowout wins. This is something that, for example, Ken Pom ratings does not. A 40-point win is worth double a 20-point win in that ratings. We feel that since both are blowouts, and for the purposes of a resume tool, we're saying both are comfortable margins, we give you diminishing returns on that. So a 20-point win at home is worth, I believe, roughly an 88, and a 40-point win is a 99 percentile, basically. So instead of getting double the credit, you're getting a little bit more, but not that much. That's kind of how we deal with the big wins and big losses. And then this next component, it's a little confusing. All wins are going to count more than all losses. This sounds like logic, but in some cases it doesn't work out that way. If you win by 1 at home, you're actually below the 50th percentile in home results. So what we do is we kind of bump it up and then just give you the lowest possible score above 50, and the opponent who lost on the road narrowly would get a score slightly below 50. And then the margin modulates how far above 50 up to 100 and below. And the other thing here, it says before opponent adjustment. So we're not adjusting an opponent yet. Right now we're just saying the winning team in a game is getting a higher score than the losing team before we figure out who those teams are. Okay, so this is a unique, number 4 is very unique to our system. One part of the resume when we talked to Reese and Jay was like, well, certain times you play and you don't have your full lineup, or you beat a good team but they're missing their top player. Like, how do we account for that? So it's still part of a team's resume. We don't throw those games out. But what we do is we de-weight them, and we do it in this fashion. We take the top 5 players in terms of minutes per game on each team. And based on how many minutes they usually play, we de-weight the game accordingly. So if it's the top player on the team who plays 35 minutes a game, that's going to de-weight it more than if it's the 5th player who plays 20 minutes a game. Multiple players are missing. Examples like, Xavier had a bunch of players suspended after the big brawl. That's going to de-weight the game a lot. If you're missing players and the opponent is missing players, it's going to de-weight the game even more, because that's basically your bench against their bench, and that's less evaluative of the team's resume, in our opinion. So once we have that, then it's basically a weighted average of the team's game ratings based on these missing player weights. And then the last step, not trivial, but that's where you get the opponent adjustment. It's iterative. It's based on a simple rating system like measure. It's slightly different than that, but basically where you adjust all the teams for their opponents, then they adjust the opponents for the teams, and go back and forth iteratively until you converge to ratings that will give you a BPI on a 0 to 100 scale. So here, that kind of breaks the all wins are not better than all losses, because if you beat, Grambling State by 2, it's not as good as losing at Syracuse by 2. So, okay, this is the BPI top 10 from Wednesday. This was when we did the presentation. So most of these teams are roughly the same. They might have moved up or down a spot or two here. Dean wanted me to point out there are no shockers on this list except for Wichita State. Maybe people don't know. Wichita State's nickname is the Shockers. So, anyways, Wichita State's a good team, by the way. Jay Billis has said, basically, they're not just a good mid-major, they're a good team. So these are our top 10 as of now. So you can see the win-loss and the BPI, again, on that 0 to 100 scale. What you see next to it is this net points versus average. So the 0 to 100 scale is nice. People seem to like that and grasp that as a fan, but it actually doesn't have a hard meaning. What the net points versus average is based on this system, what would this team win by against an average opponent on a neutral court in an average pace game, which is about 70 possessions. So if this is not predictive, but if we're talking in terms of Kentucky's resume and we compare it to, let's say, Syracuse's resume, basically we say on a neutral court, Kentucky is about 1.8 points better. The last column is the BPI strength of schedule. Again, this is not strength of schedule based on win percentage or opponent's wins percentage like in the RPI. This is the strength of schedule in the BPI system. So Duke has played the 5th hardest schedule by our metric. So again, and now these ratings you can see on ESPN.com, thanks to some great work by Dean and my colleague Albert Larcada. You'll see them on ESPN.com updated 3 times a week between now and Selection Sunday. And these are the ratings that you saw on the game day piece that the guys are using on College Game Day. Okay, so I was telling Mike Zarin of the Celtics about this rating system today, and I was like, you should come to my presentation. And he said, it's just another rating system, I'm not coming. So, and I get that there's, especially in college basketball sports where there are a lot of ratings, people have this sort of fatigue of rating systems. So here's a chart that kind of compares us to the ratings I mentioned earlier. What you see here, you don't have to read the whole thing, but what we see is we've taken into account these different components, strength of schedule, the key players missing, and we've weighted games that way. So it compares different, we took the best elements, of the different systems and kind of comprised them into something that we think is fairly strong. So then, the people bring up they're all correlated. Well, yeah, all these ratings are actually fairly correlated. They're going to have Kentucky and Syracuse at the top and Grambling and Binghamton and all those at the bottom. They're going to get that right. What I would point out, though, is that rankings are different. So you see this last chart. It says the average difference in rank between BPI and other systems. So, for example, BPI and RPI, if you take an average team, their ranking differs by about 17 spots. If you take the average team in the top 75 in RPI, which are the tournament teams, at large consideration, they're about 10 spots different. And you see there's differences among the other ratings. We're closer to Sagarin, but not as close to LRMC, for example. And these things make a difference. 8 spots in the rankings, that's going from a 2 seed to a 4 seed. That changes your draw, that changes who you have to play. You have to play a 1 seed earlier, And that's, since we're trying to evaluate a resume, those things make a difference. If you're on the bubble, that's the difference between in and out. So that's kind of, I want to point out that yeah, the ratings are correlated, but the differences are important. So, more about the benefits here. So again, the primary use is when our analysts discuss about, is this team deserving of making the tournament? Is this team deserving of a 1 seed, of a 2 seed? How do we do it? So we want to talk about seeding based on the actual merit of their resume. So one of the things Reese and Jay mentioned to us in this first meeting is we don't like the RPI, we like to look at if they beat a good team, but then when we beat a good team, we have to say, oh, they beat a top 50 RPI team, but if we don't believe in the RPI, why would we do that? So you can look at it here with this system, within the system, you've got how do they do against the top 50 in terms of BPI. And not just their win-loss in those games, but we have the BPI, the metric of the game score in those games. So do they win close games, or when they lose, is it close? So that, the record may not be that good, but they've played competitively against good teams or bad teams. One thing, again, that injury adjustment, which is sort of unique to our system, will help in certain cases. Xavier, after that big brawl with Cincinnati, they had suspensions that, like the first game, they were missing a bunch of players and then a few players each the rest of the games. And those games got de-weighted. And in those games, they went 1-3. They were blown out. A couple were against not very good teams. It's not representative of Xavier at full strength. The team that Xavier will take to the tourney was not the team that played those games. So when we de-weight them, it makes Xavier rank a little higher. And as of when I checked this, they were a few spots higher than the other team in the other rankings, and they're right on the bubble. So this is, again, the difference between in and out, which is a huge difference for these schools. Again, that net points versus average we can use as a baseline for predictions. Like I said, it's not designed to be predictive, but it can help you get a baseline to say, like, okay, Kentucky is here in BPI, and this team is here, and this is what the differences are. When we test the predictability of this in the NCAA tournament over the last 5 years, we were pleased to find that it's better than RPI, wins, in disagreeing games, it wins a lot more, and comparable to the Sagarin ratings, which have done fairly well in predicting tournament games. Again, not designed to predict a tournament, but does fairly well there, so we felt okay about it. One unique benefit here. Using the game level scores, you can measure how much they vary from their season scores. Basically, a measure of consistency. If a team is a 75 and puts up a 75 every game, that's a very consistent team. So teams at 75, some games are 95, some games are 55, then you get a 20, then you get 100, like a 99, I guess. Like, that's an inconsistent team. So this helps a lot with telling stories here. So you see the teams with the most consistent teams are, no surprise, some of the better teams, Kentucky, Syracuse, Duke. It's more interesting to kind of look at these top teams that are not consistent. Dayton, Notre Dame, West Virginia. Notre Dame is of particular interest. So we wrote an article a couple weeks ago about Notre Dame and saying how they're inconsistent. But everyone's like, oh, they won 10 games in a row. They're really good. They're not rated as high in our system. And then they went out and lost to St. John's and then got blown out by Georgetown. This was after they had already beaten the only team to beat Syracuse. They had good wins against Marquette. They blew out West Virginia, So Notre Dame is kind of like one of those teams where, they're probably going to get into the tournament, and you don't really know what to expect. Like, they might get in as like a 6 or 7 seed. They might lose in the first round. Or they might go and upset, Syracuse or a Syracuse-like top seed because they can play to that level. So using this measure of variation was one of the cool things we found that came out of BPI, not inherent to the ranking, but using the game level data, what can we do? Okay, so we put together this system fairly quickly over the last couple of months, and we like it, but we would never say that it's perfect. We obviously want to continue to improve. So how could we improve? One of the things is incorporating in-game score margin. So I don't know how many of you guys saw Mark Basher's presentation. It was about the win probability in the game, and I found that very interesting. Basically, the point is not all 5-point wins are created equal. Not all 10-point wins are created equal. These games differ in how they get to that margin. So if we had a measure of what was the score like throughout the game, we have a better measure of the quality of the team than just the final margin to some extent. So that's one. The second thing, Jay Billis mentioned this to us. He sometimes likes, he wants, obviously this kind of happens anyways, but he wants to weight stronger opponents more. Games like, how do you play against teams you might actually play in the tournament? So he would say, if you lose to a lower quality team, sometimes these teams overlook them. They're not going to play that kind of team in the tournament. It's not that big of a deal. So we've thought about it. There isn't exactly a perfectly logical way to put it in, but it's something that we can definitely look into more. And again, we have player level data to assess. We want to assess more value than just the minutes played. A picture of Anthony Davis there. He plays a lot of minutes, but he's also really, really good. So we want to have something where we can say, okay, when we lose Anthony Davis, it's not the same as another team losing a 30-minute player game because it's a valuable player. All right, so to sum up, basically, you saw here with the college game day that we led off with, ESPN, we're pushing analytical content across all our platforms. It's on ESPN.com. Some of our writers are writing about it. Our guys are using it on .com. Jay Billis writes a column every weekend where he ranks the teams, and he's using BPI as a very important part of that. And the biggest part here in the evolution of sports is, yes, this metric is an evolution, we think. But the biggest deal to us is the high-profile on-air talent, the Reese Davises, the Jay Billises. They came to us to ask us to make this metric. They want this. to help their discussion of the NCAA tournament teams this week during championship week. They want to talk about these things. So you heard at the end of our little video, Digger Phelps say the eye test like 5 times. And yeah, the eye test is always going to be significant and important, but their reliance on data is also, for those analysts who like it, is growing, and they want that, and they want these metrics for them. So someday we'll get Digger Phelps to be like, okay, fine, I want my own metric, but it does this, this, and this, and that's definitely possible. And that's the way we see the evolution of analytics in the sports media. So again, thank you guys for coming, and hopefully you found this informative. Wanted to open it up for any questions or comments you guys have.
Thanks for the talk. What percentage of games did you predict in the last 5 tournaments?
Was it 74?
74 plus, I think. Yeah. And when we compared to, I think Sagarin was 73. The Sagarin predictor was actually a little worse in what we looked at. And
RPI was close to 70.
Yeah.
On the subject of you factoring when big players are missing,
Yep.
I know Miami has someone suspended right now, right? I think. And they're talking about how he might miss the tournament.
Yeah.
Yep.
How would you factor that in instead, the fact that he's not going to be there? Not in the sense of he was missing for some games and he's come back. What if he's not going to come back?
Yeah.
So what you'd end up doing is you end up taking him off the list of the top 5, so that, yes, effectively, until we get to the tournament, we don't know whether those guys are actually going to be there. But what you would do is okay, what's essentially their tournament roster going to be? And then you cross them off and then redo it.
I have 2 questions. One was the net points versus average seemed to match the BPI, and is that coincidence? And then the second question was, is there a way to differentiate between a player who gets suspended versus someone who's hurt? Or is it worth looking at that as a punishment for a team that has players that misbehave?
On the first one, I probably did not a great job of explaining it. The net points per average and the BPI are the same thing, just on different scales. So the like 1 to 344 is going to be the same on the BPI scale as the net points per average scale. It's just that one has the points interpretation, the other is just a 0 to 100 scale. The second question about suspensions versus injuries, right now it's just if you are a significant player to the team and you miss the game, it's being de-weighted. It doesn't know why you missed the game. I could see some value in definitely looking at it. Our point being is, usually, like Oral Roberts beat Xavier when Xavier was down a bunch of guys. Like, even for Oral Roberts, like, is that impressive a victory? Not so much.
So our point a lot of time, when you look at the computer rankings for the BCS in college football, those computers have been told to take out information. They were not allowed to account for the margin of victory. Our point, and one of our points in doing this is, why take out information? Add as much as you can. So we're adding the pieces. The idea is that maybe we can add more. I'll reference it later in this talk, that maybe there's more that we can add. The idea is, let's add more. If there's a difference between the reason you miss a game, then if we find significance, maybe we can throw those things in.
Dean Locke, this is great work, very interesting. I'm curious, sort of to your point on the slide here about final thoughts and the on-air talent and communicating these results. I can understand, and I think it really would just be the math, right, around converting nets point versus average to some other team. But I was curious, like, have you experimented with, or have people talked about different ways to communicate it, like maybe versus, I don't know, the 32nd team or something, or more around comparing to the top teams, because people are probably less interested now. Kentucky ranks against team 150 or whatever.
Yeah, the communication is almost as hard as like doing the actual math around these things, especially at ESPN. When we talked to Jay and Reese early, I said, well, do you want a 0 to 100 scale like we have with total QBR? Do you want a points rating? And they're like, we want both. So that's why we have both columns. I guess, yeah, there's some value to doing the net points versus the last at-large team or something. But I guess for now, you can kind of compare and just do the math between the 1 and 10, and I guess that's sufficient for where we're using it at the current time. Obviously, it can expand. So.
Question I have is, are the wins valued the same? Team rankings, for instance, if you play Texas A&M in the beginning of the season when they were, let's say, a top 15 team, compared to as they're viewed now, how do the rankings take that in effect?
It's how they're viewed now. We're taking into account all game results. You kind of have to, because you don't know, in the first game of the season, like a team might be highly rated, but you don't know how good they are. So over the course of the season, they put, this ends up being a good team and that loss wasn't so bad, or this ends up being a not good team, so it's not a good loss.
So Sagarin's been around forever, and KenPom's been around for several years, and yet the committee, the tournament selection committee, still uses the RPI, which I think most people say is objectively worse than either of those. How are you? I mean, are you making any efforts to talk them into using the BPI, or what's the?
Jay Billisblue. I mean, if you read his column like every week, it's kind of like. The tournament committee should use, he uses his own, he calls it the Billis Index, which is based off BPI, but he makes adjustments because he sees a lot of these teams. But he thinks they should use the Billis Index. So as much as influences he has is kind of our best way. Like if this gains steam with a lot of our college basketball analysts, we have tons of college basketball games on our air, then maybe this committee can see that and say, hey, maybe, and it's not just BPI. We'd be happy if the committee looked at all sorts of different things. Just something outside of just the RPI would be nice. We haven't directly contacted them.
You're not actively sort of interacting with them, showing them, taking them through your process, your modeling process?
No, not at this point.
No, I know some of our writers, they know members of the tournament committee, I would say better than I don't know any of the members of the tournament committee at all. But some of our writers who are familiar with BPI, I'm sure that they're doing some of that work for us a little bit. What the formal process ends up being, it's not our job to completely change what they're doing. Hopefully we've done something smart enough that they care to listen.
Do you guys have any thoughts about the differences in strength of schedule numbers from different systems, where maybe the RPI says UConn schedules number 1, but maybe BPI it's 15? Because people make a big deal about their number 1 strength of schedule, but maybe that's not so accurate.
Yeah. We feel our measure is more complete through the simple rating iterative process. It's also consistent. RPI's measure of strength of schedule is the win percentage, not your RPI, whereas ours is the BPI. So yeah, it's a big deal. I've seen people say, UConn has the hardest schedule. They have a hard schedule according to ours. I'd have to look up the exact number, but it's not the hardest. So I guess, we're more confident in the strength of schedule. What you see, we've done a lot of here's a team that ranks really high in RPI and low in BPI, or vice versa. And a lot of times the difference is just the way we evaluate strength of schedule. And I think ours is a little more mathematically sound. Not a little more, it is more mathematically sound.
And echoing on what Alex said here, to some degree, okay, hardest schedule versus 15th or 5th or whatever. That's a hard schedule. You got 344 teams. In general, I'm hoping that there isn't much of a distinction in tournament selection committee's mind between number 1 and number 15, because it's a hard schedule. So hopefully they're not cutting it too fine.
So could you explain what the BPI ratings mean relative to each other? So maybe like a 90 rating versus an 80 or a 70, what's going on there?
Where's the question?
I don't know.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't see. I was like, where's this coming from? Yes, so the rating itself is sort of the percentile, on a game level. So Kentucky was 92.3, right? So in each game, basically, Kentucky's game performance ranked on average in the 92nd percentile. That's roughly what it means.
Yeah, so we looked recently, actually, Kentucky is the most consistent team. Of course, I think it's the most consistent team in our sample that we've looked at. And they have, a variation of 4.9 or so. Their worst game in the last couple months was a BPI of 85 or something like that.
Against Tennessee, they won by 3. So.
Yeah, and so their worst game is in the 85th percentile, that sort of thing. In my mind, it does say something, so it does lend, even though it's a percentile and It's not necessarily points. You can still use that to describe how good they are. So that's one of the points with it.
I think we're out of time, so thank you guys very much again. We really appreciate it.